Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. This is Fashion Unfolded, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything related to fashion. Sometimes it's pop culture, sometimes it's academic, but my name is Katie.
My name is Cameron.
And today we want to talk about Fashion Week, or Fashion Month a little more broadly. We both recently worked on a show, and actually Cameron was the one responsible for putting the show together. Mm-hmm. So today we want to recap what happened at that show, but also give a little bit of background and origin and into how New York Fashion Week came to be, and then speak a little bit, like I said, more broadly about fashion months across the cities, across the globe. So Cameron, where would you like to start today?
Yeah, I always love to start with New York Fashion Week. As a native New Yorker, I'm very deeply biased, but it also feels like it's something that is just so important to start in terms of pop culture, where we're at today. There's so much of the conversation around is New York Fashion Week dead? And it's okay, every time we have this conversation, it's very silly, but it also speaks broadly for me to an issue around the importance and existence of fashion weeks in general. But I think we can get deeper into that as we go on, as I think about the sustainability side and all the things. But I think starting with New York Fashion Week is a wonderful point, and you can really touch much better than I can on the history side of it.
Sure, yeah. First of all, what is New York Fashion Week? I'm sure everybody listening knows, but to just kind of put a description on the word, it is the coming together of a variety of people and creatives and fashion houses to display their new designs, right? The idea of having a fashion show is actually a fairly recent idea, and it's based in the way that we have disseminated fashion information, essentially. So if we take it back a couple of hundred years, the way that people got their new fashions was largely from fashion plates. And this was these were images that were printed into home magazines and women's magazines. And they would see these images and try to recreate dresses based off of that. Fashion photography was the next level of this idea of disseminating fashion images and fashion information. And for a long time, the way that was distributed globally was that fashion design and what was trending and what the new dress of the season was largely coming out of France and Paris particularly, and then those images would make their way across the globe. Well, this is important to consider given the fact that during World War II, we in America, in the Western world, largely got cut off from that dissemination of fashion information during the Nazi occupation of France. So in response to this, and also to encourage creativity and optimism, a sense of national pride, as well as to boost the economy during World War II, Eleanor Lambert, who is actually from Indiana, she is not a New York native, she had the idea of bringing together all of the different publications and sources of news, showing them fashion designs and letting them disseminate from American designers to the rest of America and, wherever else those images and reports may have ended up. And that happened in New York. And that is a part of how this idea of New York Fashion Week came together. It was really during this time of war and being cut off from the rest of the world in terms of news, information, and creativity when we're talking about living under things like rations, that this woman, Eleanor Lambert, was able to bring together a variety of people to showcase, in my opinion, at this point, in my contemporary ideals, American exceptionalism. Yeah. And all of this took place in New York, right? And so that is the context under which New York Fashion Week became established, and how a piece of the puzzle of how New York became a fashion city. Of course, we also have the the production and manufacture that was happening in New York, but when it comes to the creative side of New York being considered a fashion city, it's really Eleanor Lambert who was responsible for this. Yeah. And then expanding out from there, we then, this becomes a reoccurring thing. And then we, rather than it happening in department stores or in private, then we get the larger fashion shows where not just the press are invited, and also it used to be called Press Week. It didn't used to be called Fashion Week, but then also we have celebrities, we have important people like politicians who start coming. So it really becomes like an event. And then it used to be centralized. And from there, different fashion houses start having their own events. There's indie events, it grew out from there. But that context of it happening during a time of conflict, during a time of nationalism is, I think, important for us to all like establish in this moment.
Yeah, and it's something I also find interesting from another perspective. I am working on a large piece about the Ebony Fashion Fair, one of the first Black fashion shows that really blew up and was kind of traveling across the country. Started kind of like very humble roots through Ebony magazine and that empire that was created there by the Johnson Publishing House. And it is really fascinating to see, like, kind of for me, like the Black roots of fashion shows as we see them contemporarily, in terms of like the spectacle and all of that. Like a lot of it feels very connected to the church. And I think about like the department store lineage aside from the Black side of things. But just, it's really interesting to see how it's grown from something that was like so hyper local in a lot of ways and contained to their like very specific areas or stores and all that too, into this like large thing that we have today. Like I think about, the amount of shows that are on the calendar, and we think about somebody like Ruth Finley, for example, behind the fashion calendar, like the growth of shows that has come out of it. Like I think when she started, it might have been like 20 shows in the week, and now we've got like 200, not including the shows that are off calendar and all of that. So it's just really, it's wild to see its growth, just the growth of a fashion show broadly over the years.
It really speaks to the part of fashion that makes it so attractive, I guess. Like you said, it's spectacle. It was one of the first times that I think fashion had been spectacularized, if that's a word I can use, make up. But I also want to, thank you, yes. I also want to take a second. You mentioned Ruth Finley, and she is also really important in this story. Ruth Finley worked together with Eleanor Lambert for a long time, and Ruth Finley was the one who was responsible for essentially like registering and keeping track of all the different shows that were happening and maintaining them on like a physical piece of paper of the schedule of events, right? And something I would just want to flag for anybody listening is that there is a fantastic resource. When Ruth Finley passed, her estate donated every single calendar that Ruth Finley had ever kept to the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, or the archive at FIT. And there is a scholar, professor, faculty member at FIT who does really cool work with Ruth Finley's papers. And her name is Natalie Nudell, and she has undertaken the massive project of digitizing everything on those calendars and creating a map from them. So you can also see physically where these fashion shows were taking place. And they also cataloged all of the metadata from these texts, so you can search them for a variety of different things. So if you're interested in the history of New York Fashion Week and what designers were being showcased and what designers were on the official New York Fashion Week calendar, because I think that says a lot, you can go and take a look there. And, one of the things that Natalie showcased, it would be so cool to interview her someday, but one of the things Natalie showcased to my class when I was teaching at Parsons was being able to search for designers by like identity and ethnicity. I think that there's a lot of potential for interesting research looking at the, I guess, hegemonic structure of New York Fashion Week through time. So if anybody wants to look at that, please do. I am no historian. I am an anthropologist, so it's not my vibe, but I just wanted to shout that out.
Yeah. And honestly, just shouts out to Natalie broadly, because that whole project has turned into like such a huge thing. Like she just published the book that goes along with that. There was the documentary in 2020. All these things available now online. I think the documentary is on Tubi as well. But like, it's a really great example of like turning like a kernel of a research idea into this like broad universe. So I think as like fashion scholars and students of the game, That makes me sound like I am playing basketball again as a student of the game. As people who are like interested in this, it's really cool to see how something can like turn into this like kernel of a project and just like build inspiration and go from there. Because it's so cool to see the universe that's been created around that.
Yeah, I really admire her because of that. And also, topic of an upcoming podcast episode reminds me of Monica Miller, because we were just talking about how her book was published in 2009, and it was just now in 2024. I guess she's probably been working on it for a while behind the scenes, but it was announced that she was the guest curator for the Costume Institute exhibit coming up in the spring. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
But before we tangent off of that, with that New York fashion, like tiny bit of history and context in mind, I want to turn to that question that you have of like the necessity of fashion weeks, right? Because the idea behind it back in the day was, this was the way that fashion information and fashion imagery and trends and what was happening in the new season was disseminated. You had to physically go to these shows, you had to take pictures, they would be printed in magazines, printed in newspapers, sometimes not even printed in newspapers, sometimes they were simply described in newspapers. Yeah. So with the advancements of technology and the world of social media that we live in today, how does that complicate the idea of a fashion week?
Yeah, it's something that's really interesting to me as someone with like a sustainability background, because I think about the like ramifications of, sending fashion editors across the world to go to each fashion week. That would be out of the big fashion weeks, we'll say. So New York, Paris, Milan, London. And then there's so many other little events that pop up in that as well. And it's like, okay, well, if this is the avenue in which we are still continuing to disseminate fashion in this way, is that necessary to the way it's actually disseminated now, right? Like we have TikTok, we have all forms of social media where things are going much more directly to the consumer. And I love the CFDA, who's taken over from Ruth Findlay to actually manage the New York Fashion Week calendar. I love the work that they're doing, especially in the last few years where they've really gotten so many American designers back on the calendar as well. It did, getting back to that question of has New York Fashion Week lost its way? For a little while, it did feel like American designers were skipping out on that. But like, I think part of that is because what is the necessity of it? And it's shifted a lot, particularly like post like lockdown of the pandemic. Like the shows that really stand out to me are the ones that were really the most like spectacle oriented. And I think that's what it keeps coming back to. It's like an opportunity for designers to like imprint their vision in a very like buzzy media way, because that is how anything is really generated. In the way that we have this kind of attention economy, that is what is needed, like a really big moment. And I think about like the Margiela show, the Galliano Margiela show that really like captured the fashion zeitgeist for like 3 weeks, because it felt like that return to like those shows that we used to get, where it's just like big spectacle transporting us to another world. And so that's really what I love of that. And that feels like where we are kind of keeping it necessary, like those moments for me, like mini productions.
I think it's really interesting that 3 weeks is considered a long time now. And that kind of information would have been the season, right?
I know. Yeah.
But I think that what's interesting to note is that there's been, we've read it, well, maybe we didn't, but I did in our readings for fashion history and mediation when we were at Parsons. It's not just fashion history, but it's also considering the way that fashion is mediated, which is what we're talking about here. And one of those was the idea of the fashion show. The fashion show is one way in which we mediatize fashion. But then there was the question of when bloggers entered the scene and started being invited to fashion shows, and they could take pictures and report on them the next day much faster than official news sources or magazines could. Then from there, you get the next step, which is social media, which could be posted almost simultaneously or instantaneously. Then you get live streaming, right? And people sitting in the front row live streaming on Instagram and TikTok. So it is literally instantaneous
Yeah.
like dissemination or mediatization of the fashion show, which like in a way I think is really interesting because
Hmm.
it allows for an experiential access that hasn't
Hmm.
existed before. I can't say that
Yeah.
it's entirely the same experience as
Yeah.
going to a fashion show, but it's unlocked a part of the fashion show that has remained largely exclusive. I can't say with any certainty that large parts of fashion shows are live streamed anymore. I'm sure that there's some kind of restrictions against
Yeah.
that. And I think that if there are restrictions, I'm going to assume that there are. I think that that is in
Yeah.
response to the idea that the fashion show had been democratized, which
Hmm.
I think is like a big no-no for the big fashion brands. Do you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because some brands will live stream it. Some will have a media blackout where they'll like won't
Mm-hmm.
you can't really post anything until it is on social media on their end or out in the world. But it is really interesting because I think it has given access to so many people, but it's also changed now like who is coming to these fashion shows. And I was talking to one of my friends fairly recently, and their stylists. They were talking about kind of the quality of attendee at a fashion show has kind of changed, right? And I
Oh,
think as
interesting.
brands are looking to just connect to the buzzy moments, they're connecting to the buzzy people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
those folks may not have the same reverence for fashion as some of the people that were sitting front row previously, or some of the fashion editors who like had been writing about it for so long, like knew the references that were being made and just like had a different
Mm-hmm.
kind of respect for it. And so I think it's really changed the relationship to how it's consumed as well, and like what
Mm-hmm.
you're actually getting at the shows, which I find really fascinating.
Can you speak a little bit more about the way it's consumed and maybe what impact that might have on popular culture? I have to admit, um, you know that I have a disdain for designer in the first place, and I've never had an interest in going to a fashion show, and in fact, the only interest in a fashion show I've ever had is yours. So,
An
can you
honor.
speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so they fashion shows now really just serve as these pop culture moments. And so I think about this season, like I had to again, we talk about like 3 weeks being a long time in the media cycle now. This was a month ago, or it ended like what, 2 weeks ago, the fashion month broadly, maybe like uh, early October. I had to go back and look at all of the shows to remember what happened, because so
Yeah.
much of it is like so quick. And so I think about the reception of these shows, and in the moment what held on. And so like I look at like New York Fashion Week, for example, this year. Like one of the big moments was the Ralph Lauren show in the Hamptons. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
such like a signature moment for the brand to connect to like heritage and the ideals of Ralph Lauren as a
Like
concept, right?
their image, yeah.
Yes, and it connected so beautifully, and like I think similarly, like the Elia show at the Guggenheim, they're all these little like cross culture, pop culture moments that kind of bring all of these things together that make these connections to people and make these connections to like pop culture broadly, and I think those are the shows that work the best, at least in my opinion, in terms of like
See.
a communicating the brand's ideals and b connecting to an audience, because I think
Mm-hmm.
consumers now are craving authenticity more so than previously, and I think maybe craving is less the right word, but they see inauthenticity more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was cool to see a lot of these brands. Like I think in like London Fashion Week, there was one of the brands who did a show at Emirates Stadium where Arsenal plays. Labrum, Labrum, I think. Yes, and so they had like people connected to a Arsenal, the football club, be connected to London. Declan Rice was one of the players for Arsenal. He walked in the show. A London rapper, Getz, who's like one of the like OGs in the British rap world. He was walking in the show, and it like those are the moments that I saw living on, because it actually connected to like the
Mm-hmm.
brand's ideals, the community, and all of that. And so I feel like those are the things that show up, and they become these like pop culture moments for brands to
Yeah.
have and build that, because there's so much noise. There's so many brands. They're all showing. it's exhausting. It's
It
exhausting as someone who
is.
like goes to shows, and so how do you cut through that noise? And like authenticity feels like the way, and actually connecting to the to your brand and your audience.
I think you've just answered a question that I've just kind of had lingering broadly about the
Mm-hmm.
concept of New York Fashion Week, because if the idea, or of fashion weeks generally, if the idea is no longer, I guess if the need is no longer to mediatize fashion in order to like, disseminate it for
Mm-hmm.
the consumer, right? So that the consumer knows what's in trend and knows what to buy, then
Mm-hmm.
like kind of what's the point? And it sounds like
Yeah.
the idea of the fashion show has largely shifted away from this is us showcasing what you can buy and much more like an identity building moment for
Mm-hmm.
a brand.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And that's
that
why I
that
think
is
so many brands put so much into their shows. There's just so
mhm,
much like that is the moment to really kind of showcase who you are and your ideals, because otherwise you're just like in this sea of noise and it doesn't really
right.
help.
Yeah, and I was going to say, with the fact that trends and microtrends move so fast on things like social media,
Hmm.
the point of having like seasons is so moot now that
Yeah.
like trying to regulate that through the fashion show doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
But rather than saying like, hey, here's what's trendy, it's a lot,
Hmm.
and using that as a way to maybe not connect but sell to consumers. It
Yeah.
sounds like the overarching strategy, if I'm thinking like in a business term, which I hate doing,
Yeah.
that's where my brain is going, is rather than that, building brand identity, like I already said,
Yeah.
which builds trust, which builds loyalty, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and
I see.
it was interesting to also see some of the other brands kind of like as we think about fast fashion and losing any form of seasonality as these trends move so quickly. It was interesting to see a brand like H&M was out everywhere at both fashion weeks shortly after. Like they were very involved in it, and I was walking past an H&M store fairly recently, and actually not even the store. I was in a large train station here right in Soho, and they bought out the entire station to do ads everywhere about their new season collection this year. And I was like, friend, you have a new season. Basically, there's a new collection every week, every 2 weeks. And so, like, them framing it as like AW25. And it's like, we've moved away from that. And the reason we've moved away from that is mostly due to H&M. It was really
Hmm.
interesting to see their role within that. And I will like give H&M credit because they are trying to do better. I think the last week they had a bunch of like sustainability panels. They did a little pop-up thing here. They had Kate Tronada play, which is why I was there. They had Charlie XCX play for London Fashion Week. Like were really involved in the Fashion Week for a brand that wasn't particularly showing, but that's a separate aside that I found really interesting but it
I would.
connects to that
Sorry,
spectacle.
you mentioned Charlie XCX, and now I really want to talk about the juxtaposition of
Hmm.
Charlie XCX's collaboration with H&M versus Chapel Roan's like use of antique and vintage fashions on the runway. But we won't get into that right now.
Yeah, that'll be a
Um,
separate conversation.
but talking about H&M and fast fashion, like the lack of seasons or seasonality,
Hmm.
and also like, is there a need for seasonality with climate change? But I don't want to get doom and gloom right now.
Hmm.
I would love to turn to what our alternatives are, because that's something that you and I spend a lot of time not only thinking about but also doing.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So that is my
tell me,
background. Oh yeah, we're getting into it.
yeah,
That is my
okay,
background. I started in fashion working for a program funded by the Department of Sanitation here in New York City called Donate NYC. We worked for a program called the Center for Materials Reuse. So a lot of my background is focused on like textile waste diversion and all these other things. We worked with a lot of the thrift shops in the city to just have a host of programming and all that. Part of the programming for Donate NYC was this nonprofit partner organization that worked with all of the nonprofit thrift shops, reuse organizations broadly. And so I was doing communication and events for that. And one of actually probably the biggest event that came out of that was Refashion Week. And so we started in 2018, I want to say, or 2019, I can't remember. But it was at the time a first of its kind celebration of secondhand fashion. We worked with, over the years, all these wonderful folks, Heron Preston, Kid Super, the Donut NYC partners that we had. And by 2020, we'll say, it turned into this whole full-fledged event where we were working with like Tony Goodman from Vogue. We had our big runway show, and it really kind of, for me, highlighted the joy of these alternatives, right? It's like, I love fashion and I love clothing, but I'm aware of how harmful it is to the planet, to people. And so how can we have something else that like serves people and planet while also still celebrating the like joy and beauty of fashion? And so that was the thing for me with Refashion Week. It was like, okay, we don't have to like not celebrate fashion, but let's think about what this means to have fashion in a world where we are broadly going through it. I think that maybe downplays, but we're trying not to get doom and gloom here. So we're going through it is the best way to describe this. And this is coming off the heels of multiple hurricanes back to back here. So we're thinking about, you know, how do we create something beautiful in a dying planet? And Refashion was really wonderful for that. And so I'm perpetually thinking about alternative fashion shows, alternative fashion weeks, like to really kind of showcase what we got. And Refashion Week unfortunately ended in 2022 due to, how do I phrase this delicately for a broad audience? If anyone is familiar with the current mayor of New York City and his priorities, Refashion Week and, you know, general good policy did not align with what he is looking to do currently, given his time in Turkey and receiving bribes. But anyway, it is no longer with us, Refashion Week, but it was a wonderful 4-year run that we had. And for me, it has really like highlighted so many of the other things that I look for in fashion shows and fashion weeks. And after that, I kind of took up that mantle with Remake, a wonderful sustainability-oriented organization who we've inevitably talked about on this podcast before, but we will get into them again.
Absolutely.
And so for me, the last year, we've put on 3 shows with Remake. Emily, my partner, is a Remake ambassador, was community organizer for Canada before she moved here to New York to go to Parsons and get her master's there. We have co-produced and creative directed and styled the shows for the last 3 seasons. And so this past one was our...
I'm sorry, who co-produced the show?
Emily and I.
yeah. And what's that called?
Oh, yes, I am terrible at this, and shouts out to Katie for this. Through my company, Duality New York, that is, once I left the Department of Sanitation, that is what I founded. I am real bad at self-promotion. So that was through the Duality umbrella, and so Emily is on with us in Duality now, and so it was really wonderful to have her have this avenue and this vessel for us to do this incredible show. And so the first year was at like a small DIY space in Brooklyn. That was September of last year.
I was there for that. Yes. Yeah. Okay. That was the first one that I don't remember how that was like the beginning of us getting to know each other, and you said something about it, and I was like, I will be there whether you like me or not. So
and I already did, despite you not believing that. So yeah, that was the first one, and like it was very different, obviously, like than where we've kind of gotten to. Small DIY space, maybe like 100 attendees or something. I don't know.
It was
probably
packed,
less.
Though.
It was packed. Yeah. We sold out the space, and we've sold out the space every year. The following fall, we were in the winter, we were at the Delancey in the Lower East Side. Just had the first floor of that venue, sold out very quickly. Did a show inspired by the golden era of New York nightlife. And then this year, in this past New York Fashion Week, it really jumped to another level. So we had the entire Delancey space. Yes, literally. We had both floors of the Delancey. It's just this beautiful 2-floor space. The rooftop is absolutely gorgeous and has all of this like beautiful greenery. And so that really played into the theme for me that Emily and I put together, which ended up being Return to Nature was the ideals here. And so for us, we wanted to use the show to kind of highlight an industry that we really believed in. And the storyboard, as we created it, kind of highlighted how we've gotten here to the problems of the industry and what an ideal industry looks like. So for Act One, it started as a very traditional, glitzy, glamorous fashion show inspired by like J-Lo era, Versace, Cavalli kind of 2000s vibe. And that transitioned into Act Two, which focuses on the cost of an industry that is, very maximalist as that era was, and transitions into Act Two, which featured a lot of like diasporic influence styling and pieces from the global South, because if we're thinking about who's most affected by waste colonization, it is going to be the global South. So we had pieces from companies like Remade in Cambodia, who pull pieces from the waste stream there. Tiga Collective, who like works with a bunch of artisans in India, and just really featured a lot of like diasporic styling that was inspired by that. A lot of like cowrie shells and crochet pieces, and just really like beautiful, vibrant prints. And so after that, that act transitions into Act Three, where the title Return to Nature comes from. And so it was very like mossy green styling, like very earth tone stuff to kind of highlight, this connection back to nature that we need to make in order to have an industry that like really reflects where we need to be to like continue living in this world, continue living as an industry. And so, yeah, just like really focusing on like slowness and softness and the earth. And so altogether, it was really wonderful to create this storyboard and then subsequently also style all of the looks. We sourced a lot of pieces from Deals on Designers, a wonderful shop here that works with Remake and a bunch of other nonprofits as well. It has this incredible catalog of pieces. We'll link them in the resources
everything
here.
Will be linked, in the show notes.
Everything. But Deals on Designers is incredible. Paige, shouts out to Paige. We worked with them to source a lot of the pieces, but worked with folks in the Remake universe who were either ambassadors or involved in some way to tell this story. And so it's really wonderful to like bring all of these things together, from resellers, from folks who focus on ethical fashion, just to have a show that really like highlights the beauty of sustainable fashion in all of its forms. And so that was, I think it ended up being 36 looks that Emily and I styled. We photographed the lookbook together, all shot on film, which we'll also link because it is beautiful, and it is
so beautiful, visually stunning.
It was. We were very proud of it, and like even if I wasn't a part of it, I would still be very proud of it by proxy, because it was really wonderful to just like bring folks together, and especially like the really wonderful volunteer collection of models that we had, who were also folks who are involved in the climate justice movement broadly, folks who just like also really get it, which was really wonderful to bring those people together. And we have all of these associations with models historically, and there's so many folks who are doing so much wonderful work in that space in terms of advocacy and climate justice and all that. So it's wonderful to bring a lot of those folks in to like be a part of this, and also like broadly have the Remake community come together. And we are, still in awe. It's been like a month, and I'm still in awe.
I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, we ended up having about like, I think it was 400 people there. We sold it out. We were very much at capacity. And we've outgrown the space already. Yes. We have outgrown the space, but it was really beautiful to kind of see that as an avenue of what shows can look like, and how sustainability can be centered in this industry and still like create really beautiful things. And
I think you guys do something that is so incredibly important yet overlooked when it comes to work about sustainability. Like, you're like, some credit to H&M. I give no credit to H&M. There is never going to be a corporation who centers community and centers humans at its core. And the fashion industry is one of many, but I would also say one of the most visible and biggest perpetrators of exploiting humans for the sake of making money. And I think something that the remake show does so beautifully is really centering that idea of community, because like you know the names of all the models, you know all the people who were involved, you know all the designers, and it wasn't one person who had a creative vision disseminating to a bunch of worker bees, this is what's going to happen. It was this collaborative effort in which like the people who were producing it were very much hands-on and involved. And I think that that's something that's so beautiful, because not only does it take a community to come together to make something like this in lieu of money, but also when we are talking about sustainability, it's not some theoretical, way of talking about the world. It is deeply centered in the I care for the people who are sitting next to me, because they are also humans living in this reality who deserve just as much dignity as I do, and like just as much of a quality of life as I do. So like I think that the remake show really showcases that. And when we're talking about the idea of like the necessity of fashion weeks and fashion months more broadly, that is something that just like is not present in my personal opinion. I get the idea that like a fashion show is meant to like showcase the identity of the brand, and that develops loyalty in their consumers, right? But like, what is loyalty in consumers aside from give me your money and keep you poor so that I as a corporation can continue to get rich? Versus this, which is the entire opposite of it, and that is so necessary in a time when that is what the alternative is, what rules the world. I'm sorry, I am getting doom and gloom, but
but it's a reality, right? And I think it is important to kind of focus on the other side of that, because I was really burnt out for a period of time from the fashion industry, from producing shows, from all of that, because I was like, no matter what we do, what does this mean? And one of the things that got me through that was Remake, right? And like working with Remake and seeing, as we talk about community, the community that they built, the community that they build with their hubs and their ambassadors, especially in New York. Like, they have built such a wonderful community here of like-minded people. And I think that becomes really energizing for me in particular. And I think for everyone else to be like, okay, well, we're not at this alone. This is a very large problem. And y'all over there, being most of the fashion industry, are not really invested in like solving this problem, right? So how can we together kind of do something about that? And it really is that element of togetherness that I think really gives me the hope necessary to continue grinding away at this.
Yeah, and I want to point out real quick that, like, feeling burnt out from activism and from caring about these things is something that is very real and does happen. But and for a long time, the idea of, like, being in community didn't really resonate with me, because, as you know, I have, like, some social differences that make it hard as a neurodivergent person to feel comfortable. But I also like to think about it anthropologically, which is my background, so it's what helps me understand the world. But what we know about humans is that we are necessarily social creatures, and you can't do anything by yourself. And this world wants you to think that you have to do everything by yourself, and that if you didn't accomplish it by yourself, then it's not worth any value. But I have never once accomplished anything on my own. It has always been with like the kind-hearted support and like loving care of the people around me. So it comes down to community work, like things that Remake and you as a producer are doing with these shows, to actually like send a message, to actually be the difference that you want to see. Because I know the media outlets love to say that eBay did the first secondhand show at New York Fashion Week, which is not the case. But, if that's what we want to see, we have to do it,
Yeah. I mean,
how do you feel about the eBay thing?
One of my favorite piece of writings was about, eBay and the secondhand marketplaces. And so I will say, I love eBay so much. And eBay, if you're listening, hire me, because I have some ideas. But if you're not listening, yes, sponsor us, even better. If you're not listening, though, what I will say is I was very upset at reading that article. I think I saw it on Impact, and I'm sure that's what they put out in the press release, when they were just like, the first secondhand show. It's like, oh, friends, I've been out here since 2018, and I'm sure there are folks before us doing something similar. I'm sure it has been going on for years. I know for Refashion Week, it was one of the first big events of its kind like that. So
There's
I can say at
even
least since
secondhand
2018.
fashion shows that are happening in other parts of the United States. There's one happening in St. Louis this fall.
Yeah. And I
Like
will
in
give
November,
them,
like
you know, they hone their language specifically by saying the first of New York Fashion Week. And I was like, you know,
I
maybe
realized
this
it
could
was
be true. It's like, no, it's not. I was part of all of them. I was part
it
of
was
all
a,
of them for this.
it was a strategic media messaging on their part, and I understand that.
It
But
was.
yeah, it bothered me as well.
Yes.
But
Yes.
especially
But again,
because,
eBay.
didn't the show get the remake show get a shout out in Teen Vogue too? Like
It did, yes. In the same paragraph, actually, as the eBay show.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yes. Yes, it did. And like we've gotten some press last season as well as season before. So like, you know, a quick Google search will show that you were not the first even of the year at all. But again, you know, eBay, if you want to throw a couple dollars here, we could do a little something. Sponsor the show. Hit us up. We got some things for you.
Hire Cameron to be your stylist.
They did say, I will say they used Wisdom as the stylist, the like Instagram influencer who's built an incredible platform, creating all of these wonderful looks. So I will say all credit to him because like, and whatever the team was for that, he did an incredible job. The looks were so beautiful. So I will say like, you know, it's really cool to see that. It does feel a little bit different because it's using like archival pieces. So like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily stuff that was like ever going to be diverted from the waste stream because it was never going into the waste stream in the first place.
Yeah.
So that does feel like for me a kind of key distinction, but it was still really beautiful to see. And
I mean, I guess we could frame that as like evidence that the circular economy is perhaps gaining some traction. But
and I do choose to see it that way. I think that for me is at the end of the day what brings me the most joy because I remember like getting into the circular fashion world in like 2016 and seeing all of the very few players that were involved at that point. It was like Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a couple other folks, and that's about it, right? And so now seeing like on a broad scale what designers are thinking about, what larger brands are thinking about, how they're getting involved has been really wonderful. And that is my biggest takeaway. It's like, I didn't love that she said that, but also I love that it's happening.
Yeah. I do have a question though for you. As I was listening to you talk, something that popped into my head was the idea of, we talked a little bit about fast fashion and the like lack of seasonality because of how fast trends move and how fast things are produced. Is there a link between the ephemerality of a fashion show, that, and your approach to the next show? So I'm curious. There's a connection in my brain, but I want to know if there is one in your brain and what you're thinking about your next show specifically. Fashion shows have this ephemerality to them, right? You see the garments on the body and they're moving, and the model walks out and then walks back. It all happens very quickly, right? And sure, you might see images of those garments and those outfits again, but like the actual experience of being in a fashion show happens really quickly. And to me, that there's a little bit of a connection between that and the way that we consume fashion quickly on the consumer side of things. But the way that you've described your idea for the next show kind of feels like it's slowing that down a little bit. So can you expand on that?
Definitely. And there's 2 points I have in that actually as well. It's something that came out of the show. There's a piece that I designed here for the show that I have behind me here, and that will show kind of this connection to ephemerality that I kind of took issue with for fashion shows broadly. Is that some of the garments that were in the show were just stunning to the point that they deserved more time and they had more of a story than what the limitations of a runway really allowed, right? And so one of the pieces was this beautiful like denim wedding dress. It was the piece that ended up closing the show. And I wanted that to just live forever, right? I wanted people to like have more time with that. And there's another dress made by Lola Lombard, who like, paints these beautiful, like handcrafted designs onto some of the dresses that she makes. And it was just so stunning, but there's so much to take in, especially in a space like that. And so for me, it was really important to like try to find a way to slow that down and like highlight some of these designs. And so I think we're trending. I mean, there's still some options, and we're figuring this out. We're trending towards a presentation aspect in addition to a show. It's still up in the air, but a presentation seems like it fits more with some of the vibe for these pieces that I think deserve so much more than just the 45 seconds to a minute going down a runway. And for me, that also came out of the idea of a piece that I designed for Act 2 of that show, which, thinking about the CFDA and fashion shows and waste colonization broadly, I designed a piece that was inspired by the 4-bar blazer, Tom Brown's signature 4-bar look. But rather than using the like regular bar format, we created bars out of cowrie shells, something traditionally associated with wealth and opulence throughout certain Central African, West African countries. And that was really inspired from my work in my thesis of the Black Masking Indians of New Orleans, and one of the groups down there that really like focused on Pan-African styling. But I was just like around the cowrie shells and around the crochet pieces so much. I was like, how do I tie this in while also making this connection to like New York Fashion Week, New York fashion broadly, high fashion as a concept. And so that's where that kind of 4-bar blazer was born from. And it also featured elements of different fabric that was sourced from a Central African nation. I ended up using it also for a friend's wedding who's Cameroonian, so I sourced a lot of Cameroonian textiles to cover the buttons and create the pocket square. Really just kind of upcycling a piece that I found on eBay, or I think in a Goodwill here actually, years ago, and turning it into this story that really felt like it mimicked this relationship between high fashion and sustainability and waste colonization and my interest in fashion across the diaspora. So here it is behind me.
See if I was about to say, would you like to show it to us?
I was really talking it up here without actually showing. So here we have the cowrie shell detail on the side, really, and from a distance on the runway, you don't really see the shells as well, which is what I was aiming for, to kind of just highlight. It's like, oh, that's reminiscent of the 4 bars. But then when you actually get up close to it, which speaks to, again, the issues that I had with the fashion show broadly, it's like, you can't really see the detailing until you have time with a piece like this. And so that was kind of the highlight there. This is the Cameroonian textile that I got. Oh, I wish I remembered the name of it, but I don't right now, but I'll link it because it's up there somewhere. But it's really associated with like some of the artisans down there. So it's really wonderful to like use that fabric here and use it for the buttons and all this, and really just bring that like kind of authenticity to the styling process and really connecting those two things together. And yeah, it just like, it really did make me think of like how much more I would like to be able to talk about these pieces and how much more I want people to connect with them rather than just like what we had on the runway. Because it's not enough for a show of this kind and for pieces of this nature.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of a presentation because like you said, taking time to look at garments is part of the idea, in my personal opinion, of like slowing down consumption. It's not just that we want people to buy less, but it's also that there's a like a cultural value shift that I would hope for, and the idea that we take care of our garments, that we care about them not as things that are disposable, but as like living, breathing objects that have histories and stories and and communicate things about ourselves and where they came from. Like you can see in my background, for example, this is a dress that I bought from, oh gosh, what are they called? The TDF?
Yes, the costume collection.
Yes. They had a bag sale, and this Renaissance costume was just sitting there. So many people passed it up, and I was like, I have to take her home. And so now she's back here. I don't know what I'm going to do with her, but I've had the time to like look at her and see her construction and see the Metropolitan Opera tags that are on the inside of the people who wore it, so there's just this idea of like slowing down not just how we consume our clothes, but I mean, well, looking is a form of consumption, but also just like the idea of like slowing down in the presence of clothes more generally is something I've been thinking about.
And one thing on that real quick, this piece also feels like a great example of that in terms of like the life cycle of this garment, because this was something that came from a Goodwill in Brooklyn, I think it was, now that I remember this clearly. I bought it in like 2018. So since then, it has been sitting in my storage unit, which has turned between Emily and I into this like large archive of pieces of like vintage, designer, like just all of these things. And we ended up styling a lot of the show from pieces from there, whether it was from Emily owning her previous luxury consignment store that she had, Most Wanted up in Canada, or the pieces that I had. And so it was really interesting to like think about the life cycle of a piece like this, where it was like, okay, who wore this beforehand? In what way were they wearing that beforehand? How has it changed now in terms of what it's signaling? And just like, it's really cool to have these stories built into a piece like that. And that's probably my favorite part of shows like this, is like, and Secondhand broadly, is that every one of these pieces has a story. And I love continuing that story and building on top of it.
Okay, well now I'm just I'm on a tangent for a second. I have like so many ideas about like the way a presentation show could go, and I'm curious if you're thinking about including any kind of like museum practice elements with having like wall text and the object history you are. Okay, good.
Oh yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
Like, oh, I would love to write something like that for you, like helping out, because that's how I guess I'm just reimagining how a fashion show, I mean, it sounds, we both are, but like the whole conversation, the point of it is like, what is the context of fashion shows? How have they been reimagined today, and how are we going to reimagine them for the future that we want to see in like fashion sustainability? Which I think brings me to something that I know you wanted to talk about, which was the shows more globally. I was not tuned into that at all. So if you want to talk about like Paris, Milan, and London, sure. But I'm also curious about Copenhagen.
Yeah, I mean, from a quick pop culture perspective, I do love some of the highlights that came out of it, and seeing kind of like regionally what was showing off. And I think like London was probably my favorite in terms of that same connection to like location that we talked about previously. And so, thinking about Labrum with Arsenal and Paolo, what is his name? Paolo Corzana did his show. He like channeled Narcissus in his collection, and also just had his show in his backyard, and brought all these like fashion editors to his backyard, and like worked literally with his neighborhood and his community to like partially light the show with their neighbors. Like, it was a really incredible experience to see like that side of community in that. And I found it really interesting, especially compared to like Paris or Milan, where like Paris, you have like Louis Vuitton closing the week again, and like returning to that space that they had. And especially after the Olympics, it just like they were on such a further end of the spectrum of like mega brand and spectacle closing it. And it just felt really interesting to kind of have that juxtaposition so close to one another. And like celebrity really feels like it dominated so much of the discourse, both in Paris and Milan as well. Or like, I remember trying to go back while we were recording this, or ahead of recording this, just trying to remember any look that came from Milan, like a single look. And I couldn't, which like is kind of disappointing. There were a couple ones that I like actually ended up finding and being like, oh, that was beautiful. But the biggest things that I remember coming out of that at the time, especially, was a lot of the celebrity sightings that were there. Like, that was really the only thing that I feel like people were talking about, was like celebrity at insert show here, and like Kanye at Marni, or what Bottega Veneta did in terms of having all of the attendees sitting on like leather animal shaped bean bags that were like made specifically for them to like relate to whatever animal they felt like related to them. And so it was just really interesting, because that was my biggest takeaway from Milan. I remember at the time being like, yeah, there's a lot of celebrities there. And it's like, okay, well, what happened? What was the clothing? What did it look like? And so that I feel like helps me think outside of like the big four for fashion weeks. It's like, well, what are we doing outside of that? Because like I'm really interested in celebrity, but no, I don't care about celebrities, right? I'm interested in celebrity as a concept. I'm really interested in pop culture broadly, but a celebrity wearing something isn't going to move things to me. So like, what do shows look like? What do weeks look like that are not necessarily entirely influenced by celebrity? And I come back to like Copenhagen Fashion Week, which is always a big one for the sustainability aligned folks out there. That's always the one that I see on my timeline. And Copenhagen's a really wonderful one because not only is it focused on the brands, but it's focused really on the attendees as well. Like thinking about like, what is the street style of Copenhagen Fashion Week? What are people wearing? Like, I feel like that does a really great job of centering the people who are actually attending it as much as the brands that are being shown. And so I really love that.
That really reminds me of how the big vintage shows are run, actually.
Yeah.
I think especially at Current Affair, because they do a lot of modeling of the pieces that are going to be present at those shows. Maybe not in person, but they do a lot of that modeling on social media and Instagram in the lead up to the show. And then some of like the hero images, or like the hero garments, I'll call it, are usually displayed prominently at the show. But then, you know, their social media presence, their press, the responsibility of the photographers at the show are all about what the attendees are wearing. Which is, you know, creates that like very intimate experience, I guess, of like a vintage show. And
interesting. In many ways it reminds me of the Ebony Fashion Fair, and that was something when I had interviewed Audrey Smaltz, who's one of the voices of the Ebony Fashion Fair for a good while, and then became a fashion editor on her own right and started her own like fashion runway production company. Was one of the first to ever do that for Backstage Side. When I was talking to her about it, that was one of the things that she mentioned the most, was the fact that the audience was just as well dressed as the actual folks on the runway. And that became a second show in its own way, right? Where it feels the same for Current Affair, where we have folks who are coming to Current Affair knowing that they're coming there wearing their best vintage. And even when I go, or when Manhattan Vintage is this weekend as well, it's a very similar thing where it's like, oh, I gotta get a fit off here because I know others will, and it will be captured and appreciated in that way. And I
think it's mostly true.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was the subject of my thesis. I've learned that the serious resellers, they come in. Either the serious resellers or the people who are seriously there to buy something for themselves come in athleisure. At least in Los Angeles, they do. I think a part of that is not a symptom. A symptom makes it sound like it's like a pathology. I think that has to do with the fashion trends in California, but also they do that strategically to like try things on without having to take off their clothes, and so they can get pieces first. But yes, the rest of the show is very geared towards the people who are also, because it wouldn't be a show without them. And same thing for fashion shows. It wouldn't be a show if we didn't care about fashion. So why not, like reward the attendees for being there?
Exactly. And I think that's also reflective of like the people who I know going to these shows. Like I know a lot of, in New York especially, I don't know anybody in LA. LA is whatever. I love LA, but I don't know the LA vintage scene. But thinking about the people that I know that go to the shows, they are stylists, they are resellers who are either already there or like know broadly what they're going to be there doing. And so it's like reflective of my sample where they're like, no, I have to be seen because also I am reflective of like my business and I'm showing up as an influencer. I might sell things on the side. And so the people that I know, they're like, oh yeah, this is a thing. This is a broad thing that I'm like dressing up for. And I think that also speaks a lot to New York as well. I was talking about that with somebody recently where like the idea of like even going to the grocery store or like running errands, like you kind of got to get a little fit off. And I think that is like reflective of New York, but that's a separate aside here.
Oh no, that's so funny. I think actually I'm going to tangent real quick. I don't know if it's from living in New York or going to a fashion school or if I've always been this way, because I also used to dress, like very visibly 1940s, 50s vintage. And so I always dressed well. But I got dressed this morning, and I got dressed this morning, and I was taking my husband to school because he's a graduate student. And he said, "Wow, that's quite an outfit for dropping your husband off at school." And I said, "I once saw a post that asked the question, if social media disappeared, would you still dress that way?" And I was like, you bet your damn ass that I would still be dressing that way. And so when I left New York, I was like, I'm not going to move to a rural Midwest town and stop putting on lipstick to go to the grocery store. And actually, it was well rewarded, because James is my husband is an eavesdropper. He listens to people's conversations all the time. I was wearing a leopard print jacket that an alumni from Parsons gave me, and I walked past these two girls, and James turns to me and goes, "They just saw your outfit, looked you up and down, and then went, 'Oh my gosh, love her coat. Leopard print is so in right now.'" And I was like, yes. Because it's also a college town, so you get a lot of the leggings and sweatshirts. But sorry, I'm tooting my own horn here for a second. I just had to. This has nothing to do. I'm running my own personal fashion show here in the rural Midwest. That's the moral of the story.
which we love. Bring that New York energy over there.
Absolutely. I'm trying. Oh my goodness. I totally derailed the conversation.
But we were talking about fashion weeks and the local, some of the other ones. And so another big one for me that I always look to, two ones that I'll talk about briefly is, in terms of regional, Lagos and Seoul. Lagos and Seoul Fashion Week separately, I think, are doing some of the coolest things in terms of that just hyper regional style, while also making incredible garments. And I think that's the energy of these areas that aren't regarded in canon as fashion cities. It's well, you can do so much more to explore what that connection is to identity and region and all of that. And so those two for me, there's so many beautiful things coming out of that. And I think that at least feels better to me than the very commercial nature of the big four fashion weeks. Yeah. Because it's at the end of the day, it's all brands trying to sell something, no matter where you are. But this gets back to kind of that community side that we've talked about throughout this. Is there is identity building broadly in these cities that are not known as fashion cities. And so it's really wonderful to see what brands do to capture that identity and showcase that outward. And even on a local level right now, it's currently Brooklyn Fashion Week Brooklyn is going on. And so you have, last night was a Brooklyn fashion showcase in Industry City. And so it's just, there's all these little moments that we have that are showing these alternatives of what it can look like. And it's really beautiful to me.
I think something that's important to note, however, is I got kind of stuck in a thinking loop in a class I was teaching once with my students, and I kept coming back to the idea of okay, we have this more sustainable solution, but the more that we scale it and the bigger it gets, the less sustainable it becomes, right? It has a paradoxical effect on each other. So I said, I don't know what to do about that. My student looked up at me and she said, I don't think it's a scaling of technical things. I think it's a scaling of cultural values, right?
Yeah.
And so mindset. Yeah. And when it comes to the idea of having alternative fashion shows, I kind of am thinking about that, well, if this isn't what we want as our alternative, or if this is what we want to replace the traditional large scale format thing, the larger it scales, the less authentic, the less personal, the less community oriented it is. So perhaps it's not a scaling of the shows itself, but the scaling of the number of shows, I guess, or the number of communities who are involved in something like that, which I think then would perhaps come as a part of the collection of behaviors that show that people are thinking differently around the culture of clothing and how we consume it. So
and that
interesting.
That shift, I feel has been happening slowly. I think about from 2016 when I started till now, the growth of Secondhand, the growth of some of these smaller entities doing shows like this, and really consumer demand. Like I think it was maybe the ThreadUp resale report. I can't remember if it was this year's or last year's, where they were talking about that demand for. Nope, forgot what I was talking about. Maybe we do a quick. Do you have any highlights from Fashion Week that you wanted to plug? Anything else?
Do I have any highlights from the remake show? Well, first of all, I just love being involved. I've always been like, let me do something. You're like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know. I was mostly responsible for dealing with corralling the outfits and the models and getting everybody dressed, which I really loved. I love the energy from that, and I particularly this is coming from like a backstage perspective, because I rarely end up upstairs at the Delancey, which honestly I prefer because it's very overwhelming.
It is.
So backstage, I love the vibe because it's not stressful in a way that I think you would assume a fashion show is. The models are all lovely people, and they like bring books and food, and we eat pizza, and the hair and makeup team that y'all work with is also, always, everybody is just like there to cooperate and like work together and get along. And that's something that I really just like love to see. And so even though I am very socially awkward and I might just like stand at the edge of conversations, I nevertheless still love to spend like time in their company backstage. So
the vibes are immaculate.
They are. And then hearing that we'd sold out and even sold out the VIP tickets was just like such a like moment. I have to say, I really admire the way that you are like so unafraid of going and doing things. And it like, no, I'm serious. It like, I've watched from afar over the last 2 years, the way that you tackle a project, even if you haven't like thought it so strategically that it's perfect from the get-go. You're willing to just like make it happen. And I often get stuck in the like, how can I make this strategic and perfect? But perfectionism gets me nowhere. So the way that the show has like grown organically is something I admire so much. And I think it's what makes it feel so like grounded and authentic.
Yeah. And shouts out to Remake for that, like allowing the space for us, Emily and I, to just kind of do whatever we want, and just empowering us to like lean into that. And also second, the community that they like have behind them, I think also allows that, because it's just like there's so much growth, there's so much energy. Like that's why the models reflect the vibes being the way they are. That's why the audience reflects that, because there are so many little things that it's like, oh, this could go wrong. What does this mean? And it's like, honestly, it means nothing for this kind of show, right? Like, I want everything to be perfect. I've planned out everything. I've done every single step. The music has been coordinated, blah, 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 all of it. Sometimes shit goes wrong. And at a show like that, that doesn't matter, because that's not like what is important, because we're not here to sell things, right? We're not here for this to be perfect. We're here because we are oriented around community and sustainability and those values. And so those values don't align with perfection. That's not the fit there.
Sorry, I'm like, my brain is
a very capitalist organization.
That's what I was just about to say. Yeah. And, oh my god, my brain. Well, I think my brain has been like squeezed enough. Maybe this is a good place to round things off for today.
It is.
I think that was a great conversation. Before we end, though, I'd like to just like shout out some things. Obviously, we've shouted out like Natalie Nadell and Remake and Emily and you and Duality, but I also want to just shout you out again, because before recording this, someone just got an interview at a really big fashion school. So send Cam your congrats and your good lucks and well wishes. And I also want to toot my own horn and say that my first piece of professional academic writing is going to be published in an academic journal in December. So stick around for that. Y'all can read it. So many people have asked me if they could read what I've written. And I'm like, here's an official version that you can't plagiarize because it has protections. So we're both
it's exciting times here.
Things are actually happening after graduation. I just want to give us both a little toot for that.
Who would have thought?
Who would, not the hard work and years of effort we put in, no.
Oh, I love it.
So, yeah. All right. Well, I will stop being self-centered. And thank you all very much for listening to this episode. Cameron, do you have any last thoughts?
No. Shouts out to everyone involved in the fashion show from Remake End and all the models and all that. It was incredible. Please go look at the lookbook and the resources. Thank you for listening.
Alrighty, and we will see you guys in the next episode.
Thanks, y'all.